Hello, boys and girls. I am ready to read chapter 2 of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. And if you would like to see my really cool sloth, rainbow, unicorn, St. Patrick's Day shirt, go ahead and watch the Number Talks video that I just posted before this one. So here we go. We're going to find out what's going on in chapter 2, which is titled Mr. Willy Wonka's Factory. So if you got to watch the movie, you saw him standing in front of the factory and some really weird worker came up to him, some odd man, and kind of scared him and said, "Nobody goes in and nobody comes out." So candy is constantly being made in this factory, but yet none of the workers come to work and nobody leaves after work. So who's really making all this candy? We're going to find out. Here we go. In the evenings, after he had finished his supper of watery cabbage soup, Charlie always went into the room of his 4 grandparents to listen to their stories, and then afterwards to say goodnight. Every one of these old people was over 90. They were as shriveled as prunes, and if you don't know what a prune is, ask your parents to show you a picture on YouTube. And they were as bony as skeletons. And throughout the day, until Charlie made his appearance, they lay huddled in their one bed, 2 at either end, with nightcaps on to keep their heads warm, dozing the time away with nothing to do. But as soon as they heard the door open and heard Charlie's voice saying, "Good evening, Grandpa Joe and Grandma Josephine and Grandpa George and Grandma Georgina," then all 4 of them would suddenly sit up and their old wrinkled faces would light up with a smile of pleasure. The talking would begin, for they loved this little boy. He was the only bright thing in their lives, and his evening visits were something that they had looked forward to all day long. Often Charlie's mother and father would come in as well. They would stand by the door, listening to the stories that the old people told, and thus, for perhaps half an hour every night, this room would become a happy place, and the whole family would forget that it was hungry and poor. One evening when Charlie went in to see his grandparents, he said to them, "Is it really true that Wonka's chocolate factory is the biggest in the world?" "True!" cried all 4 of them at once. "Of course it's true. Good heavens, didn't you know that? It's about 50 times as big as any other." "And is Mr. Willy Wonka really the cleverest chocolate maker in the world?" "My dear boy," said Grandpa Joe, raising himself up a little higher on his pillow, "Mr. Wonka is the most amazing and the most fantastic, the most extraordinary chocolate maker the world has ever seen. I thought everybody knew that." Whoop. Sorry, lost my page. Okay, here we go. So that's them in the bed, the illustration. "I knew he was famous, Grandpa Joe, and I knew he was very clever." "Clever!" cried the old man. "He's more than that. He's a magician with magic, or with chocolate. He can make anything he wants. It's that a fact, my dears?" The other 3 old people nodded their heads slowly up and down and said, "Absolutely true, just as true as can be." And Grandpa Joe said, "You mean to say I've never told you about Mr. Willy Wonka and his factory?" "Never," answered little Charlie. "Good heavens above! I don't know what's the matter with me." "Well, will you tell me now, Grandpa Joe, please?" "I certainly will. Sit down beside me on this bed, my dear, and listen carefully." Grandpa Joe was the oldest of the 4 grandparents. He was 96 and a half, and that's just about as old as anybody can be. Like all extremely old people, he was delicate and weak. And throughout the day, he spoke very little. But in the evenings, when Charlie, his beloved grandson, was in the room, he seemed in some marvelous way to grow quite young again. All his tiredness fell away from him. He became as eager and excited as a young boy. "Oh, what a man he is, this Mr. Willy Wonka," cried Grandpa Joe. "Did you know, for example, that he has himself invented more than 200 new kinds of candy bars, each with a different center? each far sweeter and creamier and more delicious than anything the other chocolate factories can make. Perfectly true, cried Grandma Josephine, and he sends them to all the four corners of the earth. Isn't that so, Grandpa Joe? It is, my dear, it is, and to all the kings and presidents of the world as well. But it isn't only candy bars that he makes. Oh, dear me, no. He has some really fantastic inventions up his sleeve, Mr. Wonka has. Did you know that he's invented a way of making chocolate ice cream so that it stays cold for hours and hours without being in an ice box? And back then, an ice box is also known as a freezer. You can even leave it lying in the sun all morning on a hot day and it won't go runny. But that's impossible, said little Charlie, staring at his grandfather. Of course it's impossible, cried Grandpa Joe. It's completely absurd. But Mr. Willy Wonka has done it. Quite right, the others agreed, nodding their heads. Mr. Wonka has done it. And then again, Grandpa Joe went on, speaking very slowly now so that Charlie wouldn't miss a word. Mr. Willy Wonka can make marshmallows that taste of violets and rich caramels that change color every 10 seconds as you suck them, and little feathery sweets that melt away deliciously the moment you put them between your lips. He can make chewing gum that never loses its taste, and candy balloons that you can blow up to enormous sizes before you pop them with a pin and gobble them up. And by a most secret method, he can make lovely bluebird eggs with black spots on them, and when you put one of those in your mouth, it gradually gets smaller and smaller until suddenly there's nothing left except a tiny little pink sugary baby bird sitting on the tip of your tongue. Grandpa Joe paused and ran the point of his tongue slowly over his lips. Makes my mouth water just thinking about it, he said. Mine too, said little Charlie, but please go on. While they were talking, Mr. and Mrs. Bucket, Charlie's mother and father, had come quietly into the room, and now both were standing just inside the door listening. Tell Charlie about the crazy Indian prince, said Grandma Josephine. He'd like to hear that. You mean Prince Pondicherry? Said Grandpa Joe, and he began chuckling with laughter. Completely dotty. And remember from his other books, dotty is an English term for crazy, said Grandpa George. But very rich, said Grandma Georgina. What did he do? Asked Charlie eagerly. Listen, said Grandpa Joe, and I'll tell you. Okay, so this chapter was kind of short. The next chapter, Mr. Wonka and the Indian Prince, is about that prince. Now, neither one of these chapters are in the movie. So you're going to have to wait a little bit until we get to chapter 4. Let's see. The Secret Workers. And this will tell you what that really creepy old man was talking about that Charlie met by the gates in the movie. So please not watch any of the movie until I've read the next chapter. And I'll try to do that today as well. That way you get 2 chapters in one day and you can watch some of the movie. The questions that I have for you, I really just have one main question from that chapter that I really want you to think about and maybe even write a response to me or verbally explain it to your parents because it's a very important part of this book. Okay, when the grandparents were poor and hungry and unhappy, when they found pure happiness, they went to their happy place. The whole family forgot about being hungry and poor. That was when they were listening to stories together and spending time with one another. I want you to think about how somebody could say that Charlie and his grandparents and his parents were very rich in the fact that they had each other and they had this wonderful time together. How does that make them rich versus somebody who may have a lot of money in this world, but even though they have tons of money, they might not have family or friends or people to love them. So think about that. Think about Charlie and how he's hungry and poor, but yet he has a wonderful family who loves him very, very much. Versus somebody who might have tons of money, but does not have a family, even though they have tons of food and maybe fancy cars and a fancy house. So how is Charlie rich, even though he's poor? Think about that answer. Talk to your family about it or write a response. I would love to hear your explanation on that. And I will try to get to another video tomorrow so you can watch some of the movie. Have a good evening, and I will talk to you guys tomorrow afternoon. Bye-bye.